In 1847, a tumultuous year in the Wild West life was a relentless series of harsh trials. Tobias Hartwell, at 37, was all too familiar with the solitude of his desolate land. His farm, once his only source of livelihood, now lay barren after seasons of drought and nature's unforgiving hand. Each day, Tobias faced lurking dangers from wild animals to the unending conflicts between settlers and indigenous Native American tribes. He was a man of few words, his eyes etched with sun-weathered crow's feet. But deep down, a vestige of humanity remained, despite life's hardening influence. One fateful afternoon, a trail of fresh red blood led straight to his well, a sight not unfamiliar to a man who had witnessed so much death and suffering on this land. Tobias had seen enough animal blood in his 37 years on this damned farm to know this wasn't from a wounded deer. Something was different, an unsettling feeling rising within him. Following the pungent scent of blood, he edged around the barn, his hand tightening on his familiar rifle. Yet what he found made his hand freeze on the trigger. Slumped against the stone wall of the well was a young Native American warrior, his body contorted in pain. One hand clutched a profusely bleeding wound in his side, the other weakly reaching for the wooden dipper hanging just 3 feet above his head. The warrior's breathing was ragged, labored each gasp a cut in the air. His dark eyes, though clouded with pain, followed Tobias's every movement with extreme caution, as if death could come at any moment, from any direction. In the context of 1847, finding a Native American on your land could only mean one thing: trouble. Trouble that could get a man scalped in his sleep or burned alive in his own home. Every neighbor within 50 miles would surely advise Tobias the same. Finish that savage off with a bullet, then bury him deep where no one will find the body. Tobias slowly raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Doing so was smart, safe, and expected, but something in those dark eyes made him pause. There was not just pain. He also saw desperate thirst, the same kind he had experienced during the 1844 drought, when he'd gone 3 days without water, and thought he was going to die. It was a basic human need, transcending skin color language or which side of a war you were born on. The Native American tried to speak, his lips cracked and bloody, but only a weak whisper escaped water. Tobias slowly lowered his gun, his hand reaching for the dipper. His neighbors would call him a fool. His brother back east would say he'd lost his mind from the solitude of the frontier. Hell, they might be right. But as he knelt beside this injured stranger, placing the rim of the wooden dipper to his parched lips, watching him drink as if he'd just escaped drowning, Tobias knew one thing for certain: he was about to change both their lives forever. What Tobias didn't know was that this wounded warrior wasn't just any member of the local tribes, and what happened next would bring more riders to his farm than anything he had ever seen in his life. The fateful encounter by the well was just the beginning of a dramatic chain of events at Hartwell's farm. After helping Ayanna drink 3 dippers of water, Tobias watched each gulp go down the warrior's throat, his mind reeling with the ramifications of his actions. In this land, showing compassion to a Native American was tantamount to signing your own death warrant. Yet as Ayanna's complexion slowly regained its color, a detail made Tobias's blood run cold. The wound in the warrior's side wasn't from an animal or a hunting accident. It was a bullet hole fresh and still oozing, and from the angle and the charring around the wound, it was clear someone had shot him at close range. Just now, Tobias muttered to himself, a chilling sensation running down his spine. That meant the one who shot Ayanna could still be after him, following the blood trail leading directly to Tobias's farm. They could be riding this way right now, guns loaded, and questions Tobias couldn't answer. Ayanna seemed to sense Tobias's fear. With a great effort, he raised a hand pointed toward the horizon and made a throat-slitting gesture. The message was clear: danger was coming, and fast. Tobias's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct urged him to drag this wounded stranger off the farm, dispose of the evidence, and pretend this had never happened. but Ayanna could barely sit up, let alone walk. Moving him now would likely kill him, and leaving him here was practically making them both living targets. Just then, Tobias heard the sound that had kept him alive for 12 years on the frontier. The distant thud of hooves, many hooves galloping hard, heading straight for his farm. Ayanna heard it too. His eyes widened with genuine fear, and he tried to press himself against the well, as if shrinking might make him invisible. Blood immediately seeped through the fingers, gripping his wound. Tobias hastily grabbed the empty dipper and poured water over the blood trail, but there wasn't enough time to clean everything. The riders would arrive in minutes, maybe less. He looked down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had entered his life, and turned everything upside down in a single afternoon. This man's presence on the farm could get them both killed. But in those dark eyes, Tobias saw something he'd never seen in a Native American before: gratitude. True human gratitude. The sound of hooves grew closer, close enough to count 5 horses, maybe 6, all at a gallop, indicating they weren't coming for a social call. Tobias made his choice in that moment, knowing it might be his last. He couldn't carry the injured man, but he could hide him. The old root cellar behind the barn, if they could get there. But as he bent down to help Ayanna to his feet, the warrior grasped his wrist with surprising strength and shook his head slowly. Then he did something that sent a shiver down Tobias's spine. He smiled. Not the grateful smile of a man saved, but the knowing smile of a man who knew exactly who was coming over that hill. The riders appeared from the ridge like a storm cloud, bringing lightning, 6 mounted men kicking up dust behind them, rifles glinting in the afternoon sun. Tobias immediately recognized the leader, Marshal Dixon Webb, a man notorious for his violence, his reputation preceding him in every town, from here to Santa Fe. Webb was the shoot first, ask questions later type of lawman, especially when it came to trouble with Native Americans. He was a collector of scalps he called justice. He was the kind of man who would burn a farm and everyone in it if he suspected they harbored a criminal. Tobias stood in front of the well, his body obscuring Ayanna, trying to appear like a man with nothing more on his mind than fixing a broken fence. His mouth was as dry as the desert. Webb reined in his horse just 10 feet away, close enough for Tobias to see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The other 5 fanned out in a semicircle, hands on their weapons. This was no friendly visit. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice the lazy drawl of a man who knew he held all the power. "We're tracking a wounded Injun. Blood trail leads right to your farm." Sweat beaded on Tobias's forehead despite the cool evening air. "Haven't seen any Injuns, Marshal. Been working the south fence all day." Webb's gaze swept across the farm, taking in every detail. He missed nothing. That's what made him dangerous. His eyes landed on the dark bloodstains on the ground near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach clench. "Is that so?" Webb slowly dismounted deliberately, for that sure looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've been butchering cattle right next to your water well, I'd say someone's been here recently. Behind Tobias, obscured by the stone well wall, Ayanna remained motionless, but Tobias could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. One sound, one movement, and they would both be dead. Webb took 3 more steps, his hand now openly on his revolver. "You know what the penalty is for harboring an Indian criminal, Hartwell. It's the same as for treason. A rope around the neck until death." The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle in his body tighten like a spring ready to fight or flee, knowing neither option could save them. Webb was too close. Any sudden movement would expose Ayanna, and when that happened, bullets would start flying. It was a seemingly hopeless moment as Tobias and Ayanna stood before Marshal Webb's gun, their fate suspended between life and death. Tobias's every sense was taut as a violin string, ready for an inevitable confrontation. Webb was too close. Any careless move would expose Ayanna and trigger a hail of bullets. Then something incredible happened. Ayanna spoke, Not in English, but in his native tongue, a cascade of words flowing like music, clear and strong, despite the wounds racking his body. The words made Marshal Webb freeze mid-step, and his face drained of all color, as if all the blood had left his body. Webb's hand dropped from his revolver, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly, like a beached fish gasping for air. When he finally found his voice, it was a weak whisper. "My God, you are him." The 5 other riders immediately dismounted their weapons, forgotten their faces showing a mixture of astonishment and something akin to fear. But it wasn't the fear men usually displayed when facing an enemy. It was the fear of realizing they had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now as pale as winter snow. "Do you have any idea who you just helped, Hartwell?" Tobias stared at Marshal Webb's bewildered face, his mind spinning like a wagon wheel stuck in mud. In 12 years on the frontier, he had never seen the ruthless lawman show fear of anything. Not outlaws, not wild animals, not even the Apache war parties that had burned 3 settlements last summer. But now, Webb looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ayanna spoke again, this time in perfect English, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire farm. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so fast to find me." Webb's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's. "This is Ayanna, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring." Tobias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The peace treaty. The very treaty that had ended 3 years of brutal warfare between the settlers and the Apache tribes. The treaty that had saved hundreds of lives on both sides. The treaty that had made it safe for families to settle this land without fear of midnight raids. And he had given water to the man who had brokered it all. But if Ayanna was a peacemaker, why was he on the run from the law with a bullet in his side? "There was an ambush." Ayanna continued, his breath still labored, but his voice growing stronger with each word. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about extending the treaty to the Southern Territories. But Morrison had other plans. Webb's face went from pale to ashen. "Colonel Morrison is dead, shot in the back in an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder." "Because that's what they want you to believe," Ayanna said, leaning himself straighter against the well. "Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men in war paint, speaking enough Apache to fool witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet." The implication hit Tobias like a physical blow. Someone had orchestrated Morrison's murder to frame Ayanna. Someone wanted the peace treaty destroyed. Someone wanted this land to burn again. "Who?" Webb asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Ayanna's dark eyes hardened like flint. "The same men who sold guns to the rogue tribes. The same men who have made a fortune from this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of searching for the real killers." Webb took a step back, his hand unconsciously going to his weapon before stopping. "You're talking about treason, about corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations. And they will remain accusations until I can prove them," Ayanna countered. "That's why they needed me dead before I reached the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they shot me and left me for dead. Why they trusted men like you to finish what they started." Tobias watched this exchange with a growing sense of dread. He had thought he was merely helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he had stumbled into the middle of a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart. But what chilled him most was the realization that if Ayanna was telling the truth, then Marshal Webb wasn't here to apprehend a fugitive. He was here to carry out a murder. The silence stretched thin and taut like a wire about to snap. Webb's 5 men shifted restlessly in their saddles' hands, hovering near their weapons' eyes, darting between their marshal and the wounded Apache warrior who had just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could see the battle playing out in Webb's eyes. The marshal was caught between duty and truth, between orders and conscience. And men like Webb didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually resolved them with bullets. "Even if what you say is true," Webb said slowly, "I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I have to take you in dead or alive." He paused, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Dead is more convenient." "The dead can't testify," Ayanna replied, his voice steady despite the pain etched on his face. "The dead can't reveal who truly profits from another Indian war." One of Webb's men, a young deputy with worried eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty—" "Shut up, Bradley," Webb snapped, but Tobias could see doubt creeping into the sheriff's expression, like cracks in a dam wall. Just then, Ayanna played his last card. With trembling fingers, he reached into a deerskin pouch at his belt and pulled out a folded, blood-stained piece of paper. "This is why they tried to kill me," he said. "A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died." Webb stared at the letter as if it might burst into flames. "What does it say?" "It says Morrison discovered who was supplying the rogue tribes with weapons," Ayanna replied, his eyes never leaving Webb's face. "Names, dates, quantities. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men." Ayanna paused, his voice emphasizing each word. "Including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office was taking bribes to look the other way." The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His face cycled through shades of pallor before settling on a sickly gray-green. Behind him, his men exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly very interested in inspecting their horses' manes. Tobias felt his heart pound in his chest. He was witnessing something that could get them all killed the moment a corrupt lawman realized his own neck was on the chopping block. "You're lying," Webb snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Ayanna held up the letter. "Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died. He said it was insurance." Webb stepped forward, his hand now gripping his revolver. "Give me that letter." "So you can destroy it." Ayanna shook his head. "I don't think so, Marshal. But I'll offer you a deal. Let me live long enough to get to the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll make sure your name isn't mentioned when all this comes out." The offer hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Tobias could see Webb calculating the odds, weighing the risks, trying to figure out which option would keep him alive longer. But what happened next surprised everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted his horse and slowly walked towards the well, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Marshal, I've been thinking about something. Remember that shipment of rifles that went missing 3 months ago? The one we were told the Indians stole?" Webb's face darkened. "What about it?" "I saw those very rifles 2 weeks later in the hands of settlers heading south." Bradley's young face was flushed with either courage or fear. "Made me wonder who was really stealing from whom." The confession broke something in the group. Suddenly, the other deputies nodded, exchanged glances, recalling things that hadn't made sense before. And Tobias realized that Ayanna had just done something extraordinary. Without firing a shot or raising his voice, he had turned Webb's own men against him. If you're enjoying this tale of courage in the Old West, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will change everything these men ever knew about justice. But Webb wasn't the type to back down without a fight. And when cornered, dangerous men do dangerous things. Webb's hand tightened on his revolver grip until his knuckles were white. A cornered animal is always the most dangerous. Tobias could see the exact moment the sheriff decided that bullets were simpler than truth. "You're all fools," Webb snarled, his veneer of civility finally dropping. "You think this savage's word means anything compared to mine? Who do you think will believe a dead Indian and a couple of turncoats?" The deputies instinctively spread out hands, moving towards their weapons, but Tobias could see the uncertainty on their faces. Years of following orders conflicted with the dawning realization that those orders might have been wrong. Ayanna tried to stand using the stone well wall for support. Blood seeped through the fingers pressing against his wound, but his voice remained steady. "Truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It just is." "The truth," Webb snarled, "is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm collecting the bounty on your head." He drew his revolver with a decisive motion, the barrel pointing directly at Ayanna. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped squarely into the line of fire, his own weapon now raised. "Hold it, Marshal." The words rang like thunder across the farm. The other 4 deputies followed Bradley's lead, their guns now pointed at their own superior. Only one man remained loyal to Webb, a grizzled old veteran named Hawkins, who looked as corrupt as his boss. "You're making a mistake, boys," Webb said, sweat now beading on his forehead. "A mistake that's going to cost you your badges, maybe your lives." "Maybe," Bradley replied. "But I've made enough mistakes following your orders. I'm not making any more." Tobias watched this confrontation with growing dread. 6 armed men in his farmyard, all pointing guns at each other, all believing they were in the right. This was how land wars started. This was how good men died for bad reasons. In that moment of extreme tension, as 6 men aimed guns at each other in the farmyard, the line between law and justice blurred. Tobias stood there, heart-pounding, witnessing the fracturing of a corrupt system. This was how small wars erupted, how good men died for the wrong reasons. Just then, Ayanna did something unexpected. He began to sing. Not in English, but in Apache, a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The ancient words echoed across the farm like wind through a canyon, speaking of honor and sacrifice of brothers standing together against the dark. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The deputies subtly lowered their weapons, not understanding the words, but feeling their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily mesmerized by the sound. And while they listened transfixed, Ayanna was doing something else entirely. He was calling his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening breeze to listening ears. Tobias realized this with an icy shiver down his spine. Ayanna wasn't just singing, he was summoning. The melody ended, and a heavy silence fell over the farm, like a thick shroud. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood run cold, the distant, rapidly approaching thud of hooves, many hooves. Webb heard it too, his face paling to the color of moonlight. "How many?" Webb whispered. Ayanna smiled despite his pain. "Enough." The sound grew louder, multiplying until it sounded like thunder rolling across the plains. This time it wasn't 6 riders, not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was thundering towards Tobias's farm, and they would be there in minutes. Webb raised his revolver again, this time pointing it squarely at Tobias's chest. "You did this. You helped him signal them." "I just gave a dying man water," Tobias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The same as I'd do for any suffering creature on my land." The hooves were close enough now to feel the ground tremble beneath them, close enough to count too many to count. And finally, Webb understood what Ayanna had been planning all along. They appeared on the horizon like an apparition from another world, 50 mounted Apache warriors moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the fading afternoon sun. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that contradicted everything he'd ever known about Native American war parties. They weren't coming to fight. Leading the contingent was an elderly chief whose presence commanded reverence from 100 yards away. His silver hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his age he sat astride his horse with the dignity of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Behind him were warriors of all ages, from seasoned fighters to young boys just old enough to carry a weapon. But their weapons remained in their sheaths. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation. He still held his revolver aimed at Tobias, but his hand trembled like a man with a fever. "This changes nothing. I still have my orders." "Your orders," a new voice rang out, "are no longer valid." Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley holding up an official-looking document. "This just came in this morning, Marshal, direct from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended pending an investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb's face turned purple with rage. "You're lying." "Check your dispatch bag," Bradley interrupted, "unless you were too busy collecting bounties to read your official mail." The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the farm, unthreatening, but undeniably present. The chief dismounted and slowly walked towards the well where his son waited. With each step, his ancient eyes never left Ayana's face, searching for signs of severe injury. As father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to go through the gathered warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred, the reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peacemaker with those he had vowed to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his old hands examining the wound, his face stern with concern. Ayana responded in the same language, but Tobias caught enough English to grasp the gist, the truth, the conspiracy, the names of the real killers. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with eyes like black diamonds. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. "Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to kill him." Webb's revolver wavered. "I came here to arrest a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief countered. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have profited from the war between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Hawkins, Webb's remaining ally, was slowly backing his horse out of the circle, clearly calculating his chances of escape. "You have no proof," Webb said, but his voice trembled. The chief smiled not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the confessions of the real killers who admitted everything before they died, trying to escape our justice. And we have one other thing." He gestured to one of his warriors who rode forward carrying a buckskin pouch. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen. "Your correspondence with the gunrunners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to cover your tracks. Morrison was more thorough than you thought." Webb's world crumbled in that instant. Tobias watched a corrupt man realize that all his schemes, all his violence, all his betrayals had been for naught. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses' credible justice inevitable. But cornered animals are unpredictable. Webb swung his revolver towards the chief, desperation overriding common sense. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." What happened next was faster than thought. Ayana threw himself between the gun barrel and his father, despite his wound. The revolver roared, and 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in unison. But the shot went wide because Tobias Hartwell, an ordinary farmer who just wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshal Webb from behind, sending them both tumbling to the ground in a tangle of dust and fury. The dust settled like a curtain closing on the final act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his revolver knocked clear by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins, while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. But what happened next was what would stay with Tobias for the rest of his life. The chief slowly walked over to where Tobias sat, catching his breath in the dirt. His ancient face showed no emotion as he surveyed the white farmer who had risked everything for a stranger. Then, without warning, he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition. Ayana translated his voice thick with emotion. "My father says, you are now a brother to our people. What you did today, showing compassion to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear. Those are the actions of a true warrior." Tobias felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening to let in a light he had never seen. All his life he had been taught that Native Americans were savages, enemies, obstacles to civilization. But looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he had never received from his own people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had ever witnessed. The Apache warriors dismounted their horses and formed a circle around him. One by one they approached and touched his hand. Not a handshake in the white man's way, but something deeper, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color or culture. When the last warrior had offered his respect, the chief presented Tobias with a gift that took his breath away. A war lance adorned with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief explained, "and his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone who was not Apache until this day." As the sun set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Apache prepared to depart. Ayanna's wound had been properly tended by the tribal healer, and though weak, he would live to see the peace treaty extended and the true conspirators brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Ayanna gripped Tobias's hand firmly one last time. "You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples." "I just gave a thirsty man water," Tobias replied. "Sometimes," Ayanna smiled. "That's how the world changes. One cup of water at a time." 24 hours later, as the title promised, they were gone. But they left behind something precious proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human kindness could still work miracles. Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to murder. The gun-running operation was dismantled, and the peace treaty was not only renewed, but expanded to include all tribes in the territory. And Tobias Hartwell, a simple farmer who had shown compassion to a stranger, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache tribe. Because sometimes, in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles aren't won with bullets or violence, but with something far more powerful: the courage to see your enemy as human, and the wisdom to choose compassion over fear. And so the story of Tobias Hartwell didn't just end with justice for Ayanna or the conviction of Webb. It opened a new chapter, not only for him personally, but for an entire land seeking peace. Webb and Hawkins, the corrupt and traitorous men, finally faced the justice they had so long evaded. The judge's gavel fell decisively, condemning them for treason, corruption, and conspiracy to murder. The gun-running network was dismantled, and most importantly, the peace treaty was not only renewed, but expanded, covering all tribes in the territory. But the most incredible part of this story, the part that truly etched itself into our hearts, was Tobias's own journey. From a solitary farmer, he became a symbol of courage and humanity. His formal adoption into the Apache tribe was more than just a personal honor. It was a historical milestone, making him the first white man ever to be welcomed into a culture that had long been misunderstood and demonized. Tobias Hartwell proved that in a world rife with division and hatred, a single act of kindness can ignite a flame of hope and change everything. You see, Tobias's story isn't just a historical page from the Wild West. It's a powerful reminder of the power of choice. Tobias faced fierce societal pressure and imminent danger, yet he chose compassion. That's the true American spirit, the spirit of pioneers who dared to break down old barriers and build a better future. Now, as Tobias steps into a new life, let's reflect on his role. He's no longer just a farmer, he's a bridge builder, a silent hero who laid the groundwork for understanding and harmony. Perhaps Tobias should continue this mission, using his unique position to further promote peace and cooperation between settlers and tribes. He could become an unofficial negotiator, a storyteller sharing valuable lessons of tolerance and mutual respect. Let's champion the values Tobias represents. Let his story inspire us so that each of us, wherever we are, can find the courage to do what's right. And for Tobias, the journey has only just begun. What will he do next with this great honor? Will he continue to be a beacon of peace, or will he find a new purpose on this land? Only time will tell.